So the next big revolution we have is going to be the Haitian Revolution. And again, like I said at the very beginning, these revolutions are going to build off of one another. And the Haitian Revolution is going to be going on while the French Revolution is going on. In fact, it's going to ultimately be one of the reasons why, and we'll get to this here in a couple minutes, why Napoleon actually has to go and to sell the Louisiana territory to the United States to try to compensate for the loss of the wealth that had been contained within Haiti. So to start off here, Samnonique, later called Haiti, what had been a French Caribbean colony. Specifically, and you want to add this here next to number 1 underneath capital C, that this was a sugar colony. This was a sugar colony. And, clearly if it's a sugar colony and it's a very productive one, Haiti is going to be regarded as the richest colony in the world. And of course, because it's a sugar colony, the vast majority of the population are going to be slaves. So the example of the French Revolution, like I told you before, these revolutions are going to build on one another, sparked a spiral of violence. Do you want to put down here next to number 2? That the French Revolution sparked other slave revolts in the Caribbean. Not only will the French Revolution spark other slave revolts, but the Haitian Revolution itself will spark other slave revolts. Now, obviously, none of them are going to be successful like the Haitian Revolution, but nonetheless, there's a lot of upheaval that's coming in the Caribbean because of the French Revolution and also because of the Haitian Revolution as well. But this revolution in Haiti is going to mean different things to different people. It begins as a massive slave revolt in 1791, where the power gradually is going to shift to the slaves, who are led by a former slave Lavateur. The result here is going to be very unique with the revolution. Like I told you earlier, it is the only completely successful slave revolt in all of world history. In fact, it's so important you want to put a star there. By number 3, and then go ahead and flip. So once the revolt is over, the country is going to rename itself Haiti. Haitians are going to define themselves. Haitians are going to identify themselves with the original native inhabitants. That's where they're going to come up with the names. By the way, they're going to declare the equality of all races. You do have a couple Europeans that are there, but really, not many. And the plantations are going to be divided among small farmers. So here's going to be the problem. For a while, they will continue to grow sugar. But like I've told you a couple times in some earlier chapters, sugar production only works well on the large scale. It's difficult to try to break it into smaller farms because the work is so labor intensive. In order for it to be profitable, not only do you have to use slaves, but you also have to have large scale production as well. Ultimately here, the destructiveness of the revolution, the internal divisions, and the external opposition are going to lead to poverty and unstable politics. You'll see the next couple times that we kind of come back to this region, it's just this constant overrolling of dictators, really, for lack of a better idea. But in a bigger picture, Haiti's success is going to generate great hope and also great fear. There's going to be hope amongst the enslaved population in the Caribbean and also in the southern part of the United States. And there's also going to be great fear over those slave-holding entities, those people, those countries. Like, oh no, this is giving our slaves a really bad idea. And if they see that the slaves in Haiti are successful, they're going to try to do the exact same revolutionary tactics here. Ultimately, one of the larger consequences of this is that Napoleon is going to have to sell the Louisiana territory to the United States. For this simple reason, you want to put this down here next to D, number 5. Just put down he needed money. Not only is trying to stop this slave revolt expensive, but he also loses the revenue of this absolutely massive and amazingly profitable sugar plantation as well. Now, the other series of revolutions that are taking place here are going to be the Spanish-American revolutions. Now, there will be some other ones here later on, and you'll kind of see that they run parallel to it. And again, starting off with, like I said earlier, these revolutions build upon one another. The Latin American revolutions were inspired by earlier revolutionary movements, where we have the native-born elites, the Creoles in the Spanish colonies of Latin America, were offended at the Spanish monarchs' efforts to control them in the 18th century. Not much different than what was going on in North America. In fact, you want to put down here next to number 2 that this was nothing unique. Again, if you think about it, the colonists in North America were cheesed off at the English monarchs' efforts to control them. So, same vibe, just different place, realistically. The Latin American independence movements were going to be very limited at first for a couple reasons. And in fact, these reasons are going to be important. So before we highlight them, you just want to go ahead and put a big star next to A, B, and C here underneath number 3. They're limited because there's little tradition of self-government, of local self-government. Again, these guys are being directly ruled by the Spanish crown and the viceroyalties. So there's no colonial government set up there. Society, because of this, was more authoritarian with stricter class divisions because it was a little bit more based upon European standards rather than the colonies creating their own. And the whites were also vastly outnumbered. Remember, this never was a true settler colony. So you don't have a lot of Europeans coming and settling within Latin America, within the Spanish-American colonial holdings. Instead, you have a lot of imported Africans for labor. You also have what's left in the indigenous population and a handful of Europeans. You have these groups independently, but then you also have the inner relationships of these individuals as well. Ultimately here, most of the Latin American independence was done by 1826. Gaining independence is going to take a little bit longer than it did in North America, in part because Latin American societies were torn by class, race, and regional divisions. You also want to add here next to, or you can even put it underneath A in number 5. You want to put, please, that every area had its own colonial experience. And if you remember, like I told you a couple chapters ago, that the Europeans, or the Spanish and also the Portuguese, but mainly the Spanish in this area, each of the colonies was or served a different purpose. Some were completely agriculturally based, others were mining based, and their experience with the Spanish is going to be very different. The only thing that kind of holds them together is going to be, or these independence movements that holds them together, is going to be their desire to get rid of the Spanish. But everything beyond that, what they want, they don't hold any type of, common purpose. Guys, go ahead and flip. You should be at the top of page 6. What also doesn't help is the fact that we have the fear of a social revolution from below shaping the whole independence movement. The independence movement is being dictated and run basically by white guys. And these Creoles, these, Spanish who were born within the colonies, these, people of European descent, are concerned that some of these other groups, like the African slaves, what's left of the indigenous population, people that basically aren't quote-unquote European, are going to get in their heads, okay, wait a second, we got rid of the Spanish and we were cheesed off with them. Our life isn't much better. We're still kind of angry. So let's now go ahead and revolt against the other Europeans that we see here. So these Creoles are going to be very stingy with who they want participating within the revolution. Leaders of the independence movement appealed to the lower classes in terms of nativism. They argued that all free people born in the Americas were Americanos. So they do try to create an element of togetherness. It's just not going to work out really, really well, or at least as well as they thought, because many of the white and mestizos regard themselves as Spanish. They identify with their native, or at least their parents or their grandparents' native ancestry as being Spanish. But many leaders were liberals and influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. So again, we have a rollover of some of the themes here. But in reality, the lower classes, Native Americans and slaves, got little benefit from independence. In fact, you want to put down here next to C, underneath number 6, that many of the social distinctions will stay even after independence. So in other words, these lower classes, these Native Americans and slaves, are basically still getting kicked in the teeth. The people are just wearing slightly different shoes that are doing the kicking. The next time we come back and we have some Latin American revolutions, it's going to be run by these guys. They're going to be working at getting more out of those that still identify themselves as being Spanish. In general, and as usual, women are gained very little from the independence struggle. And it did prove impossible to unite the various Spanish colonies, unlike the United States. And this is for a couple reasons, and we need to make sure that we identify these couple reasons. So you want to go ahead and put a star here by A, B, and C underneath number 8. One, the distances are greater. I mean, we're talking about a much bigger area to cover. The colonial experiences were different. I mean, the one thing that they had in common was that they wanted to get rid of the Spanish overlords. But beyond that, the specific complaints they had about the Spanish are going to vary from one place to another place. You also here have much stronger regional identities existing. A lot of the people here, especially what's left of the indigenous population, are identifying themselves, or rather are continuing to identify themselves based upon their ancestry. They're seeing themselves as descendants of Aztecs, of Incans, of Mayas, or they're seeing themselves different from, or collectively, they're seeing themselves in colonial terms and being different from the other Spanish colonies. Ultimately here, Latin American countries are going to become increasingly underdeveloped, impoverished, undemocratic, and unstable. And this is going to basically be what we're going to be dealing with in Latin America when we come back to it within the next couple chapters. You're going to see that this really becomes a massive problem, and we will have future upheaval here.